George Brandt, a local laborer in Portland, Oregon, is walking down the street in the vicinity of 47th and Fremont. He is on his way to ask a nearby construction crew, as he'd done several days before, if they have any work for him. As he hustles along, he's suddenly tripped up by something. It wasn't a crack in the sidewalk. It wasn't a fallen tree branch. It wasn't a child's toy or a discarded piece of trash. It was something else. (1911). It was a particularly violent year in the Portland area. Barbara Holtzman, a 5-year-old going to the market for her parents, was grabbed, murdered, and stuffed into a bed at a rooming house in Albina during the spring. June of that year brought on the infamous unsolved butchering of the Hill family just south of the city. In between these crimes, March 28th, the Portland police receive a call from a street contractor named J.P. O'Neill expressing that a dead body had just been discovered near their construction site. After literally stumbling onto the body, George Brandt rushed to the construction site, telling them of his discovery. He took O'Neill to the discovery site on 47th Avenue near its intersection with Fremont Street, where he noted a dead girl, approximately 16 to 17 years of age, dressed in a manner that suggested she was a girl of affluence, discarded in some brush, with a fractured skull. This implied she had been killed by blunt force trauma from a large object. An initial examination told authorities that she had been there at least a day, possibly 2. While most newspapers only referenced that the body was found along 47th Avenue, I was able to ascertain that the discovery site was practically right at Fremont Street, based on 3 factors. 1, and most vague, the body was discovered along the Rose City Park neighborhood, whose northwesternmost point just happens to be at 47th and Fremont. 2, the discovery site was deemed to be approximately 7 blocks north of Sandy Boulevard in 47th, which leads us to Fremont Street. And 3, the body was reportedly discovered near the Rose City Park Cemetery, which happens to be bordered on the west by 47th Avenue and bordered on the south by Fremont Street. Why it's so important to determine where this body was found will be made more clear later on. I visited this location in the summer of 2020 when I produced a little video on this story, but I wasn't as knowledgeable on the case at the time. I ended the video definitely feeling suspicious over the whole matter, but not being fully certain about how I felt. While I cannot say for certain exactly what happened, I can say I have a much stronger conviction about this case than I did before. Thus, this case needed further immersion on my part. This much is known about the first 24 hours or so of this case after the discovery of this Rose City Park murder victim. She had died from blunt force trauma to her head, evident by a fractured skull. She was dressed in a very well-to-do manner. She was found near 47th and Fremont, an area that was developing but still fairly populated. The victim was approximately 16 to 17 years of age, essentially a junior in high school. These were not just random details assumed by passers-by or abrupt conclusions reached by ill-informed newspaper reporters. This was the information given by officers as well as personnel from the coroner's office after they'd arrived on the scene. A day had passed, and gradually details about this event began to change. Certainly authorities can get a thing or two wrong on the first examination, but the things they apparently got wrong are without any logical explanation. At this point, the victim was still described as a well-dressed 16 to 17-year-old girl, but the cause of death had changed drastically. While still regarded as a murder, the cause became a gunshot wound to the temple. A caved-in skull to a small bullet wound in the temple? Even a complete novice could distinguish between those two. There had also been no reports or witnesses in the area who heard any gunshots. This led authorities to believe the girl had been murdered elsewhere and her body transported to where it was found. The police were working on two possible theories on the matter: that the girl had been lured somewhere or ambushed by some lunatic, or possibly this had been the work of a jealous and/or scorned young man whose advances this girl had rebuked. So, if we give the authorities a very strained benefit of the doubt with regards to this confusion over the cause of death, this was still an unsolved murder investigation. But oh, what a few hours can change. Susanne Quiring. She was born near Dallas, Oregon, likely in 1899, to a John Quiring and his wife. They lived on a farm near Dallas, but when Susanne was only 3 years old, her mother passed away, and her father sent her and her older sister Katie to live with their aunt in Salem. In 1908, their aunt married a Peter Scheidman, and they all then relocated to Portland, where they lived in a house at the corner of what is today Northeast Monroe Street and Vancouver Avenue. This is the intersection of Monroe and Vancouver. And based on the descriptions of the address, the home that Susanne Quiring lived in would have been approximately on the northwest corner of this intersection, which again now we're surrounded by stuff related to the Emmanuel Hospital, which is the land that it's on now, so any houses on this block would have been demolished quite some time ago. But her address was 253 Monroe Street, where she was living with her aunt and uncle. And the location is 217 Northeast, or just North Monroe today, which put it right at the corner of the intersection. This is Monroe, and then Vancouver is this crossing street next to it. While living here, Susanne attended the Shaver School, which was once located just down the street at Mississippi and Morris, an area completely different now and overrun by the I-5 freeway and on-ramps to the Fremont Bridge. This is all we really know about Susanne Quiring. I couldn't so much as find a picture of her, but this girl would ultimately be identified as the victim found in Rose City Park. Susanne's aunt, a Mrs. Peter Scheidman, would be called to see the body of a girl who had died as a result of a gunshot wound to the head. She would identify this girl as her niece, Susanne Quiring. Susanne, officially, died as a result of a gunshot wound to the right temple. It was also determined, tragically, that this gunshot wound had been self-inflicted. It was devastating, accepting the reality that a young girl had taken her own life. But the resolution of Susanne's situation provided authorities with another resolution, an identity for the young woman who was found dead on 47th Avenue. Now, it's hard enough to understand how law enforcement could confuse a caved-in skull with a gunshot wound, but how did this murder suddenly become a suicide? Well, simply put, the .32 caliber revolver responsible for the killing was found still in Susanne's hands. 2 rounds were neatly wrapped up in a handkerchief on her person. This made a suicide seem like an obvious conclusion to reach, but this also begs another question. Why did authorities maintain that this was a murder? If the gun had been found right there in her hand, a suicide inference would have been made clear from the start. But it wasn't. How? It took more than a day to acknowledge this was a suicide. The gun, which beyond the caliber and the mention that it was a revolver, was left in further mystery and was identified by Peter Scheidman's brother as belonging to him. So clearly, Susanne had gained access to Peter's gun and used it to kill herself. But Peter couldn't figure out where Susanne got her ammunition from. Authorities felt this matter was resolved when a box of soft-nosed .32 caliber ammunition that Peter owned was found to be missing 2 rounds. This matched with the 2 rounds found on Susanne after her death. But this, in and of itself, is not even definitive.
So in essence, authorities cinched up the situation by saying there's 2 bullets missing from this box that Susanne's uncle had. It's her uncle's gun, and they found 2 bullets in a handkerchief on her. So 2 and 2, situations taken care of. Problem is, what about the round that was in the gun that was found? What about the round that Susanne fired? That's at least 4 rounds that she would have taken. So was there another box that we don't know about? And if there was, why didn't anybody say anything about it? Were there already 2 rounds in the gun? And if so, why would there even be an issue of needing to seek out this box of bullets? Why would they be so inclined to look at this box of bullets and see how many are missing? Wouldn't they check the gun first? Wouldn't they ask the uncle how many bullets were in there? Why would they excuse this in such a simple way while completely dismissing half of the ammunition that would have been involved? There weren't 2 bullets, there were 4. See how complicated it gets?
Whatever the case, the matter had officially been resolved, and Susanne Quiring was the Rose City Park victim, and it was a suicide. The gun and the bullets were the strongest elements in this case to point to a suicide in the case of Susanne. But we're not here to discuss her suicide yet, but rather the claims that she and this Rose City Park murder victim were one and the same. Remember, when this girl was first discovered, it was noted that she was dressed in a very well-to-do manner that implied she was likely from an affluent family. Susanne Quiring was not from an affluent family. She was practically a foster child. She was described as an orphan in some newspapers. Conveniently, once she was identified as the victim, the clothing of the victim changed with it. Now she was just wearing a, quote, plain dress. Why this sudden change and downgrading of the attire that the victim wore? We have already established, using multiple references, that the victim in question was discovered at 47th Avenue near Fremont Street. Well, once Susanne Quiring came into the conversation, the location of the victim's discovery changed to 37th Avenue and not Street. There are several problems with this, namely, these two intersections are located nearly a mile apart. They're not even in the same neighborhoods. Remember, this victim was said to have been found in the Rose City Park area. One article even stated it was on the edge of the Beaumont neighborhood. Well, these two neighborhoods just happen to border each other right at where 47th and Fremont meet. 37th and Knott, on the other hand, is located in the Grant Park neighborhood, several blocks west of Rose City Park. Two completely different locations. In addition to a relocation of the discovery site, the description of the general area changed with it. Initially, the body was found in some brush near a developing area, an area traveled enough that the man who discovered the body practically tripped over her legs as they stuck out. This matches with the general area of 47th and Fremont, which, as we can see in this 1912 map of Portland, really close to when the murder happened, was developing and right along the city's boundary. Not overwhelmed with people, but still developed. Once Susanne Quiring came into the picture, the location where the body was found was described as isolated. A thicket. The Corvallis Gazette called it a woodland path, and the Statesman Journal called it a stretch of lonely woods. A much more barren landscape than previously described, and not representative of 47th and Fremont at that time. If one looks at this 1909 map of Portland, they'll note the city boundary was at 33rd, leaving the future site of 37th and Knott as open rural land. Granted, development of this land began shortly after, but even by the 1912 map of the city, after Susanne's death, it still shows only meek development in the vicinity of the block of 37th and Knott. While these locations then complemented their descriptions, it doesn't explain how law enforcement, as well as the press, could get the locations so bizarrely wrong. This is the intersection of Northeast 37th and Knott Street. This is where authorities would say Susanne Quiring's body was found. Now, there's one fundamental problem with the notion that the vicinity of this intersection is where Susanne Quiring was found. Is up until Susanne Quiring's name came into the fold and a murder suddenly became a suicide, all the reports not only said that the victim was found at Northeast 47th and Fremont, they even specifically referenced the cemetery that's right next to it, and that is there. So that's further vindication that they had the location right, because they literally used a landmark to point out where it was. That location is about a mile from here. So how, for more than a day, you completely get the location wrong when you have police on scene, you have a construction crew on scene, all these people, the reporters are talking to people there. How is it that you get the location wrong by almost a full mile? 47th and Fremont's like off that way. How do you get it that wrong? And how does that, the location of the discovery of the victim, how does that change the exact moment that it goes from a murder to Susanne Quiring suicide? That's very strange. As mentioned before, Susanne had been attending the Shaver School, which was only an elementary school as opposed to a high school. Why is this important? Let us also remember that the victim was initially identified as being 16 to 17 years of age. It turns out Susanne Quiring was only 12 years old when she died. Look, I'll tell you right now, I personally am terrible in terms of trying to guess one's age. Sometimes I'll miss by more than a decade. But I'm telling you, I can still tell the clear differences between a 12-year-old and a 17-year-old girl. How are these not only the same victims, but the same incidences? But this is how it was settled. These first reports were not even corrected as mistakes, but rather just never repeated, almost as if they never existed. Push the public to forget, and they will. After already putting the majority of this piece together, I continued to dig for further information, primarily previously undiscovered articles. I stumbled onto a piece from a Spokane, Washington newspaper that discussed efforts to identify the victim immediately after their discovery. This addressed how Susanne Quiring came into the fray, as her aunt had noted she had left home but had not made it to school that day. This implies something highly significant. The Rose City victim was, again, found on the afternoon of Tuesday, March 28th. And there's no way Susanne's aunt could have meant Monday when she said she didn't make it to school, as this was the day she was reprimanded, or at least spoken to, by Principal Spires. So, clearly, her aunt must have been referencing Tuesday in this scenario. This means that Susanne was alive as late as mid-morning on March 28th. But examinations of the discovered body range the time that it had been there from 2 days to at least the night before, or Monday night. And yet, this same victim, Susanne Quiring, is supposedly alive as late as 5 to 6 hours before the body was found. There's just no way. But this does cast a great deal more intrigue on Susanne's situation, as before this, I figured she must have wandered away from home sometime Monday night. All in all, this new discovery only served to solidify my perspective on this bizarre mystery. While all initial reports expressed that the dead girl likely lived in the area where she was found, and the initial searches done in the area were focused on that vicinity, Susanne Quiring lived almost 3 miles east of the initially reported discovery site at 47th and Fremont. Thus, a 12-year-old girl, during a time when nobody walked long distances unless they had to, went out of her way to walk a fairly lengthy distance only to end her life there. But now we're moving in a new direction.
Now, hopefully by this point, you've caught on to why I'm covering this particular story and how I feel about the case, and that the authorities said a mistake. This individual that we found murdered in Rose City Park was actually a 12-year-old girl who committed suicide about a mile in another direction. And in reaching that personal assertion, I became very fixated on trying to find out why the murder of the Rose City victim happened and why it would be covered up to show that it was somebody who it very clearly wasn't. However, I didn't spend a lot of time till I started this particular video thinking about Susanne Quiring specifically and how strange her story is.
When I first took notice of these troubling elements in this case, I became fixated on why the Rose City Park murder victim would be covered up. And we'll get to that. But I paid little attention to what should have bothered me about Susanne Quiring's reported cause of death. If we separate Susanne's details from the Rose City Park victim's details and take them all at face value, she was discovered in a wooded area with a gunshot wound to the head, the weapon in her hand, and extra ammunition on her person. A perfect appearance of a suicide, but perhaps a little too perfect. While a wound to the right temple can be representative of a suicide, of course, it can also be indicative of a shot by a perpetrator, especially if firing from up close. But more troublesome than that is the fact that the gun was found still in Susanne's hand. This is a very rare occurrence. According to a piece published in the National Library of Medicine, they expressed that in a study of 498 suicide cases, the gun was found still in the deceased's hand 25% of the time when a handgun was used. Many who have analyzed the aftermath of suicides would argue the deceased holds on to the weapon even less often than a quarter of the time.
People don't die like they do on television. They flop their arms around, and I've seen weapons thrown 30, 40 feet away from the body of a suicide, but I've never found one still in the hand.
And, once again, there is the odd fact that Susanne, after obtaining her uncle's gun, walked at least 44 blocks to a random, underdeveloped area before taking her life. Walking this distance might make sense if Susanne had some connection to that area around 37th and Knott, but there's nothing to suggest she had such a connection. However, if she were killed by someone else, it would make sense to leave her in an area like 37th and Knott. That's a hidden, wooded area where you could leave a body and likely go unseen. Also, perhaps, whomever may have been responsible might have lived near that location. Just food for thought.
So if the official story that ultimately became the final story is to be believed, the home that would have been right back here behind me is where Susanne would have gained access to a pistol as well as at least a couple of rounds that she took with her and left. And what's interesting is, one of the last places she would have been seen alive would have been here at this house she lived at. And she ends up ultimately, officially being found dead at what is now Northeast 37th and Knott Street. We're like
almost 50 blocks away from there. And that just rings strange to me, that she's only 12 years old. It's 1911. People didn't walk long distances unless they had to. So she gets this gun and bullets, and it's a done deal. She's gonna kill herself. But she walks like some 50 blocks this way, goes way out there in order to do it. Would have taken her probably more than an hour to get there, being, a younger 12-year-old. And that's just so strange to me, why somebody would walk that far before killing herself. It's either the story's either not all it's cracked up to be, or there's some little extra something that we don't know about Susanne Quiring and her final day. That seems strange to me. A distance that great, if anything, that seems more like she was taken somewhere and then killed in some form or another, either by her own hand or by somebody else. And while 37th and Knott was not yet a fully developed area, there were homes close to there, and yet nobody in that area heard any gunshots during this time period that Susanne had supposedly shot herself. These issues do not prove that this was not a suicide, but they make me wonder if Susanne had actually met with foul play. The suggested reasons, why Susanne took her own life only strengthen that wonderment. The first reports regarding her motive stated that she had recently been reprimanded at school and that she felt great shame over this and ruminated over the embarrassment. On Thursday, March 23rd, 5 days before she was found dead, it came to the attention of the Shaver School's principal, T.E. Spires, that Susanne had passed 2 notes to a fellow student, Charles Black. Both notices served to criticize the young man, who was reportedly 4 years older than Susanne. Charles showed these notes to his parents, who then contacted Principal Spires, who promised to discuss the matter with Susanne personally. The following day, Friday the 24th, Spires planned to speak to her, but he stated that Susanne was not at school that day. He waited then till the following Monday, March 27th, to speak with her. He said she expressed regret over the notes, but he was called away during their discussion. Spires stated outright that Susanne had not been reprimanded, and yet apparently only a day later Susanne was found dead over the shame of her, quote, reprimand. Principal Spires was quick to express disbelief that this note-passing incident was the reason for her suicide. Was he right? Or was he just trying to deflect responsibility from the school, and more importantly, himself? This gets to the core of the question as to whether Susanne was actually suicidal. Everyone who knew her said she was a happy child, and those closest to her could not think of any reason why she would take her own life. And when I put out my previous video on this case, it baffled me that this girl would kill herself over a minor chastisement at school. A note here, yes, I understand that suicide is a sensitive subject, and that many people who have taken their own lives have shown little signs that they felt that way. Even in that vein, this minor scrape still seems rather meek to trigger the events that reportedly followed. And Susanne was an outgoing, confident kid. She was so confident that she'd just gotten in the face of a boy who was 4 grades ahead of her. And after a day, most newspapers had abandoned this definitive reason for her suicide, mostly at the direction of Principal Spires. He expressed that Susanne had told her fellow classmates previously that she planned on taking her own life. But these classmates weren't spoken to personally on the matter. Spires was just taken at his word. And there's one big issue with that. He said that Susanne had told her friends about this on Friday. Friday. That wouldn't happen to be the same Friday that he said he couldn't speak to Susanne because she wasn't at school that day. Yes, it was. Again, it seems Principal Spires was just looking to deflect responsibility on the matter. And so, Susanne's motive became that. She was just suicidal. Which again, there is nothing to really justify. It appears, however, that this claim was not strong enough. It was noted that Susanne had not expressed a reason to kill herself to her classmates. This statement abruptly changed, however, and ultimately it was decided that Susanne Quiring took her own life because she was suffering from an illness. I found nothing to substantiate this, even from her own aunt and uncle with whom she lived. They were just as baffled as everyone else, with her aunt adamantly believing that she had still been murdered. The fact of the matter was, none of these perceived motives were without doubt. In fact, there was still so much doubt on the matter that the local coroner planned on having an inquest on her death. This was reported in the March 29th edition of the Oregon Daily Journal. But then, only one day later, and in the same newspaper, it was reported that there would no longer be an inquest on Susanne's death. Based on the apparent nature of the case, the coroner simply changed his mind. And after this report, this bizarre case vanished forever from the headlines. And why shouldn't it have at that point? Authorities had their resolution and something of a motive, and it was time to move on. And this was 1911. There was no social media to spread dissent. In fact, dissent by the public at this time was mostly saved for a small sect of the population, often all just dismissed as anarchists. All this said, I am deeply suspicious that Susanne Quiring was the victim of a homicide, although I cannot claim 100% certainty that it couldn't have been a suicide. If it was in fact a murder, what might the circumstances have been? I feel there are two possibilities, namely that she could have been killed by a jealous and/or angered fellow classmate, or she was lured away by someone older, either a sex fiend or just a demented killer. Some may say this was 1911. Crazed killers like this weren't around yet. Oh, yes they were. This was a much more common practice than some may realize. In the vein of Susanne being killed by a fellow classmate, or rather, just a young individual like herself, I feel this would be the less likely of the two, but not improbable. Killer children certainly weren't the norm, but we have to remember the time and place that we are dealing with. Portland, early 1900s. This was a rough town, rife with transience, racism, crime in all of its forms, and, in particular, lots of violent, often alcoholic, men, many of whom were husbands and fathers. I cannot tell you about the number of murder cases I have found from this time period involving deadbeat, drunken husbands, raging on their wives and their children. It taught a lot of young boys of that generation the power of violence, and that men had power over women. One of the most tragic examples of man's, quote, influence on his son came in 1902 when two young men, George Baldwin and Frank Carlson, engaged in a fistfight in northwest Portland at the promotion of Baldwin's own father. The two men fought until Carlson collapsed after a punch to the stomach and died a short while later. Also, lots of young men learned at a very young age how to handle firearms and to even enjoy and relish such an experience. One of Portland's most forgotten and yet significant killings of the time involved that of an 11-year-old boy named Jackson Reed in 1908. Reed lived among the ruins of the Lewis and Clark exposition that happened back in 1905, when a man named George DeMars entered Reed's neighborhood while fishing in nearby Guilds Lake. Reed and other kids accosted him. Reed told his younger sister to go get their gun, which, upon receiving it, Reed shot DeMars to death with it. It later came out that Reed had been heavily manipulated by his stepfather, who taught him, in essence, to shoot anyone he felt was suspicious. This is the world many young men were growing up in when Susanne Quiring was found dead in 1911. This clearly does not prove a young boy was responsible for her death, but it must at least be up for consideration. A more likely scenario, as I see it, would be that an adult lured and or abducted Susanne when given the opportunity, and that they were responsible for her death. They grabbed her, killed her elsewhere, and left her body near 37th and Knott. This would explain Susanne's being found so far from home, nobody hearing any gunshots, Susanne being found in a secluded, almost hidden area, and the gun and bullets being found so perfectly placed on her person. Alas, there were a great number of children killed by adults during this period in history, in particular along the West Coast. In Portland, the police hadn't been dealing with the Barbara Holtzman case even 2 weeks yet when the Rose City victim Susanne Quiring situation came to light. Only a year down the road, 12-year-old Mildred Green would be found in her bedroom in Eugene, Oregon, with her throat slit. Her killer was never caught. At the same time, 8-year-old Vivian Greenfield of Los Angeles was killed by her stepfather. During this time, the nation would also be shaken by multiple unsolved murders, from the likes of Anna Poltera in Los Angeles in 1909 to Elizabeth Nolte in Cincinnati in 1915. These crimes were happening, sometimes by people who knew their victims, and sometimes not. And finally, while I found nothing to implicate them, frequently it is those closest to the victim that are the ones responsible. Thus, the Scheidmans must be addressed, if just briefly. The only strong piece of evidence to bolster a suicide in the Quiring case is the fact that the gun she held was identified as belonging to her uncle, Peter Scheidman. So how could an outside killer obtain Peter's revolver? It was more likely that Susanne just took the gun herself, or possibly, if one of the Scheidmans was responsible, either by accident or by intention, they just used the gun they had and left it with Susanne to make things appear like a suicide. Granted, if Susanne was murdered by someone she was at least acquainted with, it's possible this individual could have ingratiated themselves into the Scheidman home and snatched up the gun at some point there. Certainly, by Susanne using a weapon obtained from under her own roof might add to an argument for suicide, if that is what occurred. But in a murder case, this could just as much suggest a murder from within the family. It was Susanne's Uncle Peter's brother that identified the weapon, not Peter himself, who actually owned the gun. Peter also, seemingly, played dumb about where Susanne could have gotten the rounds for the gun when he had an almost full box of bullets at home. The early 20th century was also rife with cases of young people being murdered by relatives, often killings triggered by abuses of alcohol and or drugs. Whatever the catalyst, these types of horrible tragedies again did happen. I personally do not believe an intimate relative was responsible for Susanne's death, even if it was a murder, but it is something that needs to be considered. In producing my first video on this case, as well as later examinations on the matter, it wasn't until I was already in the process of creating this piece that I began to reflect on the suspicious nature of Susanne Quiring's suicide. I had been so focused on the mystery of the victim found near Rose City Park that I neglected Susanne's case for the most part. Overall, the question of how Susanne Quiring died and why I believe there was another murder victim found at 47th and Fremont are not necessarily connected. And that brings us to the most burning question in this whole entire mystery. While it is impossible to prove beyond any doubt, and I would never claim otherwise, I believe a cover-up occurred in the case of this young woman found dead at 47th and Fremont, and that she was not little Susanne Quiring. But a cover-up requires a reason. So why? Why cover up one murder by calling it the suicide of another? I personally feel this is potentially a two-part issue. One part would be that the Portland police were trying to save face, and the second, more importantly, would be to protect those closest to this, quote, mystery victim. I will address these two pieces in that order. Exactly 2 weeks before the discovery of our Rose City Park victim, March 14th, 1911, the proprietor of a rooming house that once stood at Russell Street and Mississippi Avenue discovered a horrendous sight: a little 5-year-old girl who had been brutally assaulted and murdered, her body stuffed under bedding. A middle-aged man, name unknown, had rented out the room where she was found. Her name was Barbara Holtzman, and her murder, to this day, has never been solved. She was discovered only blocks from where Susanne Quiring lived. The Holtzman murder was one of the most depraved and disgusting murders in the history of Portland, and by March 28th, extensive pressure was on law enforcement to finally crack the case. Suspects had come and gone with no progress. The strongest suspect to that point was a George F. Brown. But on March 28th, the day the Rose City Park victim was found, it was reported that Brown was released, leaving the police back at square one, and they were about to have a fresh mystery murder of another girl on their hands. Portland police were already taking enough heat in the Holtzman case, and they did not need double the heat with a new mystery. And the Rose City Park victim was destined to be just that. They didn't have a weapon, they didn't have a crime scene, they didn't have a suspect, they didn't even have an identity for the victim. Or did they? As I have said, the Barbara Holtzman case alone presents a reason for why the police would be desperate for a convenient resolution to this new murder case. A resolution that Susanne Quiring conveniently provided for them.
When I first began delving into this case, I was most interested, to be honest, in George Brandt as a potential and possibly missed suspect. Could he have killed her and then, to look innocent, ended up being the one who discovered her as well?
The other construction workers in the area expressed that Brandt had acted strange during these days that he had gone to them asking for work. I also felt the authorities were too quick to dismiss him, but in the end, I had nothing beyond that to really be suspicious of him. And perhaps I wasn't thinking big enough. But just for reference, before we dismiss George Brandt as an innocent, let me just point out that amidst my research, just over a year after this murder, in July 1912, he and his wife were arrested at their home on Southeast 34th Avenue for running a disorderly and depraved house. There were underage girls being provided alcohol there, probably amongst other things. Just so you know, maybe George Brandt wasn't a killer, but he wasn't a great guy either. But why? Why would there be a massive cover-up if this deadbeat was responsible? And why wouldn't the police just throw Brandt under the bus for the crime, whether he was guilty or not, if it was to their benefit? No, my personal theory on the matter goes pretty high, but again, it's just my theory. Some of you may think it's far-fetched, but I don't. I honestly believe the victim, who was found dead near 47th and Fremont, was a girl from an at least moderately successful and or prominent family. This would explain all the initial statements that she was dressed like she was from an affluent family. How this girl turned up dead, I cannot say, but I am much more suspicious of someone immediately connected to her family than a random stranger or acquaintance being responsible. It may have even been an immediate family member that was responsible. There has always been something to be said for insanity in wealthy families. I don't want to get into specifics because, again, this is just my theory. But if a girl from an affluent or influential family turns up dead, and someone immediately connected to that family is responsible, that's something the family would want to conceal. They don't want their reputation to be destroyed, and something like this would certainly do that. I didn't come to this place lightly either. It behooved me to have an understanding as to how the Portland police functioned at this time, allowing me to address the question of, would the police cover this up at the request of said affluent family? What state were the police in at this time? Well, simply put, the Portland Police Department was a shambles at this time, beyond issues such as the unsolved Barbara Holtzman murder. In 1910, the noted corrupt mayor of Portland, Joseph Simon, was replaced by Alan Rushlight, who was presented as the candidate that would clean things up in the city. In reality, as referenced from the blog of the late J.D. Chandler, Rushlight had his share of corruption, including using the city's police force for his own benefit, including having them engage in things like raids to distract the public from other goings-ons around town. The police force, for all the decent, hard-working officers they had, were rife with philanderers, alcoholics, and grafters. Officers were frequently disciplined for drinking on the job, possibly the worst case being in the case of an officer, George Richards, who, in 1910, was fired for drunkenness in the aftermath of denying attention to an electrical lineman who'd been electrocuted by a power line. This ultimately led to the lineman expiring on the way to the hospital. And leading this often inept police force was the chief, A.M. Cox, who, around the time of the Rose City Park murder case, had been indicted for negligence of duty. In particular, it was uncovered that Cox, as well as several other officers,
had been paid grafting money by more than 100 deemed disorderly resorts around the city. For those who don't know, grafting, as it's defined, is the acquisition of money, gain, or advantage by dishonest, unfair, or illegal means, such as taking bribes or extortion money. Cox's corruption was so deep that upon returning from vacation one time, he had to scold his whole department for spreading gossip about his crooked activities. Ultimately, by late April 1911, only a month after the Rose City Park murder and Susanne Quiring's suicide, Chief Cox resigned, only to be replaced by Enoch Slover, another high-up in the police department known for bribes and corruption. Taking action by replacing corruption with more corruption. Something we can certainly identify with nowadays. But simply put, there was chaos and instability going on within the Portland police when March 28, 1911 came along. All of this corruption peaked only a few months later, in August 1911, with further grafting charges made against the department. It was a bomb ready to go off, which is exactly what happened by the end of the month, with the police department experiencing the greatest shakeup in the history of the force up to that time. Over 75 officers were relocated. Several sergeants were demoted. Some patrolmen became detectives, and vice versa. This was Mayor Rushlight's reported effort to stamp out vice in the city and make the police department work more efficiently. But what these ongoing charges that had come to light during 1910 and 1911 revealed about the department was that they had no problem taking money to turn the other cheek on crime. So in the most simplest of terms, the greatest controversy facing the Portland police during this time that the events I've discussed in this video took place, their greatest controversy was their willingness to take money in order to not investigate things. And a lot of this was in relation to brothels and houses of ill repute. Now, if the police were taking money from those places, those types of places, to not investigate them, imagine the kind of money a wealthy family could offer up. Say, hey, don't look into this. It's an embarrassment to our family. And those who want to say it's a far-fetched notion that a wealthy family would go this far to cover up something that might embarrass them, I mean, I hate this saying. I hate it so much, but maybe you need to brush up on your history a bit. There's such an extensive history of wealthy families covering up their sins, especially if it's something involving the death of an immediate family member or the murder at the hands of an immediate family member, and trying to cover that up as best possible. Because you got to realize, not so much anymore. Nowadays, people don't even really know who the wealthiest families are for the most part. But back then, wealthy families were revered almost like royalty. So their reputations were a lot more important in the public eye. So what are the odds that during a time where literally we see a massive shift in the structure of the Portland Police Department just a little bit after these events take place, and the greatest catalyst for it all is grafting, the taking of money to not investigate things? I think that is the strongest possible theory in this case, is that based on the appearance of this victim, she likely came from a wealthy family, not necessarily the wealthiest family in the world. I'm not saying she was a member of like the Ladd family. You know, even a modestly wealthy family could probably pay up as much as any brothel could. And if this idea potentially sounds extreme, far-fetched to someone still, again, this is just what I feel is the strongest likelihood in this case. And if the notion that there was a cover-up that involved a well-to-do family, and then potentially, you know, the case of Susanne Quiring falls into law enforcement's lap, and they say like, oh, hey, that girl that, you know, we just found, Susanne Quiring, isn't that kind of out by where we found so-and-so? And they can make the connection there. Is the idea that this was a big cover-up involving a at least modestly wealthy family, is that any more far-fetched than the idea of a 17-year-old girl morphing into a 12-year-old girl? Is that any more far-fetched than a crime scene literally leapfrogging a whole neighborhood and moving a mile? Is that any less far-fetched than seasoned professionals in law enforcement and in the coroner's office saying, yeah, this is a mysterious murder, when apparently there was an obvious gunshot wound to the temple and the gun is sitting in the victim's hands? What I'm getting at is, as far as I'm concerned, the evidence that is had shows pretty clearly that these were two unrelated instances and not one and the same, with a series of mistakes involved. So I feel I've already made that case. So whatever the motive was, whatever the reason for the cover-up was, I feel like the burden of that doesn't even lay on me. But because I'm one of those guys that likes to cover all of his bases, I started delving a lot before producing this video into the why would this happen? Why would this happen? Because that was one thing in the past when I've addressed this case that I didn't really cover. So it was something I wanted to address in relation to a lot of other things that I hadn't addressed previously. So yeah, that's where I stand. These were two unrelated incidences that the law enforcement was conveniently able to push together. It was at a time where they'd willingly take money to not investigate something. Not that that hasn't happened in other times, but it was a big deal at this time. And I think whatever family this young murder victim was from, you know, the well-to-do families know what's going on in town. And I think they knew, hey, this is a tight position. This is going to embarrass us. This is going to bring shame to our family. We're going to need to cover this up and just do something. Here, police, here's some money. Make this go away. And they did. They convinced in a couple articles over like 2 days, hey, that whole murder thing, no, it was a suicide. So that situation's taken care of. And within like 3 or 4 days of reporting on it, once they said it's Susanne Quiring, it's Susanne Quiring, it's Susanne Quiring, completely vanished from the press. You know, the public was convinced. You know, they couldn't research things the way they could now, and they didn't have as much reason to be suspicious of law enforcement for doing things crooked, you know, your general public. And such could be how a case like this gets covered up rather quickly and then vanishes forever.